Greetings, my name is Chamomile, and this is an exploration of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today, we're looking at the Chiss Ascendancy and its neighbors in the unknown regions. We are deep in the unknown regions here, which means basically everything we know about this part of the galaxy, we know because Thrawn told someone about it. There are no sector maps to cross-reference, no corroborating sources to confirm anything, which is why we're covering like 10% of the galaxy in one video. It's gonna be a big one, but also we don't have nearly as much detail here as we do in other parts of the galaxy. In fact, you're going to hear me talk about a half-dozen-ish alien nations in this video, each one of which would be at least one full sector by themselves if they joined the New Republic. They aren't going to get full videos because every single one of them would be one of those videos where we don't know enough for me to find anything interesting to say, so the video is only like 45 seconds long. So think of this as an over-sector compilation video, but without any component videos. The Chiss Ascendancy is easily the most famous part of Chiss Space, but we don't know a whole lot about it. Thrawn's memoirs focus a lot on his own career, which is mostly spent either in space or visiting neighboring nations as a representative of the Chiss Ascendancy. The Ascendancy is ruled by a council of 9 aristocratic families, and there's a lot of political intrigue and maneuvering going on between them, but Thrawn doesn't generally go into a lot of detail about it. I don't think it's unintentional that Thrawn's whole story is about the Chiss Ascendancy fighting a shadow war with the Grisk across this entire region of space, and yet we almost never see anything of the Chiss Ascendancy itself. Also, Thrawn admits in his own memoirs to lying about how Chiss society works in order to get an advantage on enemies, so probably we shouldn't believe anything he says about the Ascendancy anyway. Vagar Praxit is the homeworld of the Vagari. The Vagari show up in Thrawn's memoirs as pirates, and it seems like they're a consistent pirate problem, unlike the Liao Aoin that we'll get into later, who turned to piracy more recently because of their collapsing economy. There's also rumors on the HoloNet that the Vagari are allies of the Yuuzhan Vong, but this is probably made up. The Yuuzhan Vong are most famous from blatantly fictional stories of their attempted galactic conquest, and it's not clear if they exist at all. If they do, they don't show up in Thrawn's memoirs at all, despite some Imperial propaganda from the Galactic Civil War claiming otherwise. Bardram Scoft is an independent system ruled by the Scofti. The planet has an unstable government and trades off alliance with other powers in the area based on who was most recently assassinated. When the planet's prefect was assassinated, Thrawn, our source for most of what's going on here, was sent on a diplomatic visit, and it was like a normal thing. Like, oh, the Scofti prefect got assassinated and replaced, and who knows whose side the new regime is on. We better send someone to try and talk the new guy into taking our side. They wound up siding with Liao Aoin against the Chiss, but this was early on in Thrawn's career, which means it was like 5 assassinations ago, and who knows what side they're on now. The Liao Aoin economy was basically imploding at the time, and they were resorting to piracy to keep themselves afloat financially. They needed Scofti space as a safe haven for their pirate ships while raiding other nations like the Chiss Ascendancy and the Garbian Unity. In one of Thrawn's earliest engagements, he helped the Garbian Unity fight off Liao Aoin pirates. The Garbians were ancient enemies of the Liao Aoin and wanted the Chiss Ascendancy's help in a retaliatory invasion, but the Chiss didn't want to get into a full-scale shooting war with the Liao Aoin like that. If you're having trouble keeping track of all these nations that you've never heard of described exclusively in the way they interact with one another politically, then sorry, but our only source for any of this is Grand Admiral Thrawn, and this is pretty much the only thing his memoirs talk about. Like, the Garbians do have an artist market, if that helps, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't a defining factor of their culture. They just knew Thrawn had an interest in alien art, so they took him to a place with lots of Garbian art to peruse while they were trying to convince him to help with their conquest of the Liao Aoin. Ultimately, the Chiss refused, and the Liao Aoin survived to fight another day. Patatas Hiveborn were another long-term enemy of the Chiss that Nicardoon recruited into their coalition. We'll get to the Nicardoon later, but the Patatus and the Chiss had been skirmishing over border planets for a while at the time of the coalition. The Pakian Governance is another Chiss neighbor. They were mostly neutral, capitaled out of a planet called Rapak. And Nicardoon blockade did convince them to join the anti-Chiss coalition, but they were always one of the most reluctant members, attached to the coalition by pretty much pure coercion. Another member of the Nicardoon coalition was the Tower Dimension. Don't be fooled by the name, they aren't from hyperspace or anything. They are a regular nation from the unknown regions, just like the Pakian Government or the Patatas Hiveborn or the rest of this gaggle of alien empires. They just call themselves the Tower Dimension. Like the Pakian Government, they didn't have any particular quarrel with the Chiss Ascendancy, but the Nicardoon forced them into the coalition at gunpoint. Nickerdune were a species who invaded multiple worlds in the general vicinity of the Chiss Ascendancy at around the time of the Clone Wars, which was early in Thrawn's career. The dude was about 70 years old when he commanded the Imperial Remnant. Most people don't realize this because Chiss are a bit longer lived than the sentient average, so he looks like 20 years younger than he is. Anyway, the Nickerdune were cultivated as shock troops by the Grisk hegemony, who sought to destroy the Chiss Ascendancy, the dominant power of the unknown regions at the time. The Nickerdune subjugated several minor nations on the Chiss periphery before turning inwards towards the Chiss Ascendancy itself. But although the coalition was pretty unstoppable on paper, even the Patatas and the Liao Oin, genuine enemies of the Chiss Ascendancy, had terrible morale and fled easily whenever the battle started to turn against them. This was doubly true for the Pakian governance, who didn't even particularly dislike the Chiss. As soon as the Nickerdune no longer appeared to be in a position to impose dire consequences for desertion, their allies deserted. So the Chiss used skeleton garrisons as a delaying force on every front, while concentrating their forces on chewing up the main Nickerdune fleet. After dealing a decisive blow there, the coalition forces fell back on every front, even if they were winning, because none of them wanted to confront the victorious Chiss fleet. It would be costly even if they won, and whether or not they liked the Chiss, they didn't want this war. Not only that, but the final member of the Nickerdune's planned coalition, the Vac Combine, saw the writing on the wall and sided with the Chiss instead, despite some efforts by the Nickerdune to fool them about the circumstances under which the other members had joined the coalition. In the end, the Nickerdune were fighting against the Chiss and the Vax together, while the Nickerdune's so-called allies twiddled their thumbs at the border of the Ascendancy, doing as little as possible while maintaining some plausible deniability, just in case the Nickerdune won that battle. When the Nickerdune did not win that battle, their allies just went home. The defeated Nickerdune consolidated around the Patatus, which made a certain amount of sense. The Pakian governance had no quarrel with the Chiss, neither did the Tower Dimension, and the Liao Oin had raided Chiss shipping opportunistically because they needed money and the Chiss had more of it than anyone else. But they backed down after losing one battle with the Chiss, and the Chiss refused to help the Garbians, the Liao Oin's ancient enemies, with an attempted conquest. So, Chiss-Liao Oin relations were unstable, but not openly hostile. The Patatas Hiveborn were ancient enemies of the Chiss. It had been a while since they'd done more than skirmish at the time of the Nickerdune coalition, but still, they were unambiguous, uncomplicated enemies of the Chiss Ascendancy. And they still sold the Nickerdune out to the Chiss in order to get out from under their thumb. See, the Chiss have a certain sense of honor to them, and they don't like directly subjugating enemies. Doing so ties up a lot of troops in a part of the galaxy where nobody ever has just one enemy. If you invested all your troops in one direction, you could be attacked from another. So even though the Patatas hated the Chiss, they could trust the Chiss not to do what the Nickerdune were doing, subjugate their world indefinitely. Instead, the Chiss bargained with the Patatas for some intel on both the Nickerdune and the Vagari pirates, a general nuisance in the area, who liked to use the conflict and lack of communication between the Chiss and the Patatus to hide themselves. I mentioned earlier that the whole Nickerdune coalition was masterminded by the Grisk, who provided the weapons, ships, and intelligence that the Nickerdune general Yiv the Benevolent required to get the ball rolling. They still had some arrows in their quiver, including the Kilji Illuminae. The Illuminae is a militant theocracy who wanted to spread their so-called enlightenment to as many worlds as possible, by force if necessary. The Grisk had already prompted them to make some probing attacks near the Chiss borders during the Nickerdune attacks, but weren't able to wrangle the Kilji into a full-scale attack. The Patatas Hiveborn found out about the Kilji's attacks into disputed space between themselves and the Chiss during and after the Nickerdune remnants' attempts to consolidate in Patatas space, and the Patatas retaliated, destroying the Illuminae fleet. The Patatas had been one of the most enthusiastic members of the Nickerdune coalition earlier, so it really says something to the quality of the Illuminae's fleet that the Patatas were able to wreck them with minimal Chiss assistance, mostly just intelligence, despite having taken losses in the coalition war. Yagbui were another Grisk client state. They never invaded the Chiss directly, but they did attempt to foment a civil war between the Ascendancy's 9 aristocratic families. It didn't work, but it's something the Yagbui had pulled off before. The Grisk also used the Yagbui to infiltrate the Galactic Empire during the Galactic Civil War in preparation for an attack. Allegedly, because now we should really talk about the reliability of Grand Admiral Thrawn, professional liar. All of this political drama in unknown space comes from the memoirs of Grand Admiral Thrawn, written during the Galactic Civil War. They were recovered and published later, but they're not incomplete. They tell a complete story of Thrawn's career prior to his exile to the Galactic Core, where he encountered the Empire. They give a grand tour of all the major powers in the general neighborhood of Chiss Space, and they depict wars there as exclusively a matter of cunning naval maneuvers, tactical ploys, and careful intelligence gathering at diplomatic galas. Everything about Thrawn's life that was glamorous and impressive, and very little look at the mud and blasters on the ground, or even on battles where a simple, methodical plan successfully smashes through an enemy who attempts some intricate clockwork strategy, messes it up, the clockwork jams, and the end result is that his forces are in a very fragile position when the enemy army gets thrown at it like a brick. This is the usual outcome of someone attempting cunning ploys and complex maneuvers in major wars, and it never ever happens in Thrawn's memoirs. His memoirs also paint basically every problem in this entire region of space as being part of the grand scheme of the Grisk hegemony, a shadowy fleet of brutal conquerors led by a strategic genius who threatens to swallow up the entire galactic empire, but who also needed to resort to proxies and coalitions to fight the much smaller Chiss ascendancy. Thrawn depicts the Chiss as winning the war with the Nicardoon through cunning strategy and diplomacy, but stripping away the self-aggrandizement, either this coalition never really stood a chance and all that cunning was wasted, or the Chiss must have taken considerable losses in a hard-bitten, skin-of-their-teeth victory. No strategist is so brilliant they can reliably turn a defeat, even a narrow one, into a flawless victory in which they take no losses. It might happen ever, but it's not something they can do whenever they want. And looking at Thrawn's career in the Galactic Civil War and its aftermath, where we can corroborate his story with other sources, he's one of the more feared Imperial commanders, despite working with less material than, say, Grand Moff Tarkin, but he doesn't have a track record of outmaneuvering enemies so flawlessly that he never takes any significant losses and walks away from every battle immediately prepared for another one. So I don't believe that the Grisk posed a major threat to the Galactic Empire, or that they pose an existential threat to the New Republic now. Thrawn said so, but Thrawn's a liar. The Chiss must have walked away from the Nicardoon War, as described by Thrawn, considerably weakened, and if the Grisk were that powerful, they would have taken the opportunity to deliver the finishing blow themselves. Did you know that Thrawn claims the Chiss hyperspace navigators are called the Skywalker Corps? That sounds made up. Like, he had just been absorbing a bunch of Clone Wars propaganda films because studying the art of enemy cultures to learn about them is a whole thing with him, and so that name was knocking around in his head when he needed to make up a lie on the spot. I really hope he was talking straight to Darth Vader when he improvised that name. I doubt Grand Admiral Thrawn made up any of these nations from whole cloth. We know from his work with the Empire, which is corroborated by other sources, that he uses deception as an effective weapon. He's not a compulsive liar. Please stop calling every dishonest person a compulsive liar. Thrawn tells lies for strategic purposes to serve his own ends. Telling lies that could be disproven by sending one ship into the Chiss Ascendancy's astropolitical neighborhood and noticing that some or all of the nations Thrawn claimed to have fought with or against were totally made up would be a pointlessly sloppy lie. For that reason, I suspect the broad history of the Nicardoon coalition and war are mostly accurate. I think Thrawn probably took the opportunity to give the war the Papanoida treatment, painting it as a duel of genius intellects, first between himself and Yiv the Benevolent, General of the Nicardoon, and then between himself and Jixtus, secret agent of the Grisk, describing a war fought entirely with fleet actions, champagne diplomacy, and espionage. The things Thrawn was personally present for and good at. Partly for reasons of self-aggrandizement, but also because this is a work of art created by a man who learns about his enemies through works of art. I am very confident he was careful to only reveal information about the Chiss Ascendancy that could already be safely assumed from what the galaxy already knows about Thrawn, putting a spotlight on every Chiss capability he personally exemplifies in order to distract from how he's not giving any additional information about anything accomplished by any Chiss other than himself, thus keeping their abilities secret from potential enemies. But also I think he's flat out lying about the scale of the threat posed by the Grisk. Ultimately, if the Empire decided to bother unpicking the unknown regions not of hyperspace routes, I think they could have crushed the Chiss and the Grisk both, and Thrawn's goal was to point them towards the Grisk as much as possible. I also suspect, since this seems like a book intended for public consumption at some point, that Thrawn was hoping to use the threat of invasion by the Grisk as a means of justifying the oppression of the Empire as a necessary evil to fortify the galaxy against an external threat. This alien invader narrative gets used this way a lot. Even some rebel propagandists got in on it with the Sea Ruvi, dinosaurs with blasters who allegedly attacked the rebel fleet after the Battle of Endor before being heroically fought off. The Grisk story isn't nearly that stupid, but I still don't buy it. Now, I will say this much in Thrawn's defense. Galactic power is not measured by the amount of space you control. Space is mostly literal empty space. Only the planets in between, an astronomically puny fraction of the total volume, actually counts. And I mean astronomically literal. This is the situation for which astronomically large and small things were defined, a category so insanely past anything else we deal with that we needed a new word for it. You've seen videos. You know these things end up with more zeros than are allowed by the Yavin Convention. Any given sector has 80 million star systems in it, roughly, about 1,000 of which have some kind of arable land or mineral resources or energy source or astrographic position between other inhabited planets to be worth building something on. So it's hypothetically possible that somewhere out there is the galaxy's most insanely lucky sector with 80 times more usable planets than the rest of the galaxy put together, and that's where the Grisk live, a sector where every single planet is both inhabitable and worth colonizing. But if the Grisk have that much power, they sure aren't flexing it very much, and the fact is, Thrawn is a professional liar. He brags about his cunning ploys and strategic deceptions. He's not a sociopath or a narcissist. There's people he won't lie to because he needs to maintain a trustworthy reputation with them, but the general public are absolutely not in that category. So anytime you're hearing anything about the politics and history of Chiss Space and its immediate environs, remember, our only source on that is a guy who's probably trying to trick you.